Between the snowline of the Hindu Kush and the deserts that fade toward the Indus and the Iranian plateau, Afghanistan became a proving ground for an idea that a superpower could be made to bleed without another superpower ever announcing a war. No carriers sailed, no U.S. divisions crossed borders, no presidential address declared hostilities. Instead, crates moved in the dark, money crossed oceans as numbers on ledgers, and a network of mountain fighters, fractious, pious, proud, and pragmatic, learned to turn wrenches and sights on weapons they hadn't seen in their father's time. The world would call this covert action Operation Cyclone, but for those who lived it, the program was never a code name. It was the difference between a village being strafed by a Hind helicopter and that Hind falling in flames behind a ridgeline. It was the difference between a commander's prestige rising or collapsing with the number of rifles he could hand to cousins, clansmen, and defectors. And it was the difference between a Cold War fought through embassies and summits, and a Cold War fought through passes and wadis, where the wind carried the sound of mortars farther than it carried radio waves. The story begins earlier than the first shipment, and earlier than the first handshake in a safe house. In April 1978, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan toppled the republic and declared a revolution that promised literacy, land reform, and a scientific reordering of life. In Kabul, it sounded modern. In much of the countryside, it sounded like sacrilege, like strangers drafting new rules for old lives. The PDPA's two antagonistic strands, Haq and Parcham, fought one another even as they demanded loyalty from officers who had never sworn an oath to Marx. Arrests followed purges, and purges followed rumors, until a politics of suspicion replaced the politics of persuasion. By autumn of the next year, the revolution had already begun to devour itself. Nur Mohammad Taraki, once the face of change, was killed. Hafizullah Amin, impatient and severe, seized the chair and inherited a rebellion that no decree could smother. The Kremlin watched, worried less about Afghan utopia than about Afghan reliability. If the ally could not hold, the terrain would decide the contest, and the terrain never loved central plans. In December 1979, Soviet tanks crossed the Amu Darya. Spetsnaz struck at the heart, killing Amin and installing Babrak Karmah. The invasion transformed local revolt into international crisis. The map on the U.S. National Security Council wall did not show the intricacies of tribal loyalties, but it did show supply lines, pipelines, and the Strait of Hormuz. Afghanistan, ringed by Pakistan and Iran, sat uncomfortably near the oil that powered global growth. If the Soviet Union could not be dissuaded at the conference table, perhaps it could be harried at altitude. The Carter administration weighed options in the vocabulary of the Cold War: sanctions, boycotts, rhetorical condemnation. Those were necessary. But the tool that promised leverage without escalation was covert aid, money, training, weapons selected for deniability, and intermediaries who would do the touching so Washington could claim clean hands. The partner was never in doubt. Pakistan, its military government under General Zia-ul-Haq, balancing internal Islamization, external insecurity, and long memories of partition, offered the routes, the frontier, and the bandwidth to turn strategy into shipments. The Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, the ISI, agreed to serve as the filter through which money and materiel would flow to the insurgency. The CIA, careful by instinct and constrained by politics, would fund and source. The ISI would distribute and train, selecting who merited rifles and who would wait for next month's convoy. In Langley, planners liked the indirection because it lowered risk. In Islamabad, the indirection meant leverage. With crates came influence. Whoever controlled the spigot controlled which Afghan parties and commanders would rise or fade. Inside Pakistan's frontier cities, especially Peshawar, the crowded organizing hub for refugees, fixers, and politicians in exile, the resistance learned to speak in press conferences while fighting in valleys. 7 Sunni Islamist parties, later called the Peshawar Seven, became the political umbrellas that donors could see. Under those umbrellas, meaning beneath the banners and beyond the press statements, sat the fighting strength whose names mattered more to tactical outcomes than to diplomatic communiques. Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Panjshiri chess player of guerrilla tactics, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, ideologue and relentless tactician, whose hard-edged cohesion appealed to segments of the ICs. Abdul Rasul Saif, a conduit to Arab donors who saw Afghanistan through a prism larger than the Hindu Kush. Rabbani, Khalis, Nabi, Gailani, each with their own commanders, and each commander with his own circle of loyalty that could widen or collapse depending on who delivered ammunition before the next operation. Covert aid begins with a purchase order, but victory or defeat rests on gradients of dirt. The CIA's early procurement emphasized Soviet-caliber weapons so as not to paint fingerprints. 7.62 times 39 ammunition for AK rifles, RPK light machine guns, PKM general-purpose machine guns, RPG-7 anti-armor launchers, mortars in common, Warsaw-packed calibers. Chinese factories and Egyptian stockpiles became the invisible warehouses of a program that officially didn't exist. Crates left ships in Karachi and entered a labyrinth of trucking firms, customs officers, corruptible or cooperative local authorities, and safe depots that could evaporate when the phone rang with a warning. From Peshawar, smaller caravans dispersed into Afghanistan using mountain trails older than empire and more trusted than any new road. Every link introduced risk: extortion by police, theft by opportunists, raids by Soviet or DRA forces, betrayal by rivals. Yet the flow persisted, a bloodstream whose clotting or hemorrhage could be felt at the front within days. Weapons do not win wars alone, they must be married to doctrine. Early in the insurgency, doctrine was simple because danger was simple. Ambush convoys on predictable roads, sabotage fuel depots, harry outposts until garrisons refused to patrol beyond their walls. The enemy controlled the skies. Soviet aviation, Mi-24, Hind attack helicopters, Su-25, frogfoot ground attack jets, punished gatherings and shattered static defenses. So the resistance learned movement and concealment to a level that impressed even their enemies. Trainers working with ICIC handlers taught marksmanship, small unit tactics, demolitions, mortar correction, mine laying, and night infiltration. Manuals appeared in Pashto and Dari showing how to field strip a rifle and in place a command detonated mine. Later, as the program matured, anti-aircraft training created a different kind of confidence, that the roar overhead need not be invincible. The American domestic story of Operation Cyclone has protagonists because legislatures do. Representative Charlie Wilson used committee leverage and a taste for bold gestures to enlarge appropriations beyond what bureaucrats had initially imagined. Joanne Herring turned social capital into political capital. Inside the CIA, officers like Gust Abrakotos, abrasive, practical, skeptical of elegant theories, pushed for a program that would pressure logistics and morale, not merely prolong stalemate. Michael Vickers, a young strategist with a paramilitary mind for systems, helped articulate a package that treated the insurgency as a networked force. Saturate the battlefield with small arms, yes, but also provide robust communications, better explosives, reliable resupply rhythms, and the means to attack the Soviet backbone at the Saur Pass and along key road segments. Saudi Arabia, pursuing its own mix of alliance management and religious solidarity, agreed to match U.S. funding in a near-symmetrical arrangement that doubled the river of money without doubling the signatures on the riverbanks. Other partners, Britain with certain technical contributions, Egypt and China with production, and later more discreet channels, turned a program into a coalition without a flag. Every coalition inherits fractures. ISI favoritism leaned toward groups perceived as reliably Islamist and pliable to Pakistan's regional calculus, which envisioned an Afghanistan that would never align with India and would grant strategic depth in a hypothetical future war. That calculus frequently disadvantaged commanders like Massoud, whose charisma and competence were undeniable, but whose independence, Tajik base, and ties to Persian-speaking networks made Islamabad uneasy. Aid thus did not flow in a perfect proportion to combat effectiveness, and field commanders compensated by seizing depots, intercepting caravans, or creating ad hoc alliances that lasted only as long as the ammunition did. Western journalists who ventured into the country under escort for a glimpse of the war sometimes mistook whichever commander's guest mat they occupied for the center of gravity, contributing their own narratives to the invisible competition for legitimacy. As the 1980s deepened, the war changed because technology changed. Early attempts to give the resistance a shoulder-fired antidote to Soviet air power produced mixed results. British blowpipe missiles, manually guided and finicky under stress, performed poorly and eroded trust. The arrival of the American FIM-92 Stinger reconfigured 1,000 calculations at once. Pilots' confidence, attack profiles, convoy habits, and the distance between an Afghan fighter's trigger squeeze and the post-strike propaganda value of a flaming wreck. The Stinger was not a wand. It required training, discipline, and respect for its own limitations. But used well, it blunted a critical Soviet advantage. The psychology of the battlefield shifted. Soviet and Afghan government helicopters flew higher and faster, reducing accuracy. Air cover grew cautious. Engagements that once ended with a strafing run now ended with the aircraft breaking contact sooner, and sometimes not returning. When a weapon enters rumor, it multiplies. The image of a fighter kneeling behind a boulder, tube on his shoulder, waiting for the signature of an approaching hind, traveled farther than data on hit probabilities. For a guerrilla war, morale is as measurable as ammunition. To reduce the war to a missile is to misread the ledger. The Stinger inflicted costs and altered behavior, but the attrition that bled Moscow accrued in thousands of cuts. Convoys delayed or looted, bridges destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. Ammunition expenditures far higher than projected. Casualties that required rotation and complicated the Soviet Union's domestic narrative. The corrosive effect of a long war on an economy already straining under systemic inefficiencies. The Geneva Accords process, which sought to formalize withdrawal and non-interference, moved at the speed of interest, and interest in Moscow shifted from consolidating a client state to exiting with as much dignity as the facts allowed. In 1988, the staged withdrawal began. In February 1989, the last Soviet forces crossed the Friendship Bridge. The televised departure read like an epilogue. It was not. Operation Cyclone had never been purely about the Soviet presence. It was also about the Afghan state that would survive or fall after the occupiers left. The CIA's covert program gradually declined as the White House's attention moved, and as Congress weighed the balance between continuing to supply an insurgency against an Afghan government that remained in place and rethinking the aim now that the superpower adversary had gone home. Pakistan's interests did not decline, they intensified. In the contest that followed, factions that had cooperated against a common enemy returned to older rivalries. Kabul became a prize to fire rockets at and a ruin to hold. Some of the men trained in camps along the frontier returned to civilian life, the rifle cleaned and oiled beneath a blanket. Others discovered a vocation in war. Foreign volunteers who had romanticized jihad in the highlands carried home their own stories, skills, and networks. In time, these networks would metastasize into threats with names the American public would learn years later. To speak of blowback is to tempt simplicity. It is easy to draw straight lines in hindsight, easier still to mistake correlation for causation. The United States did not invent the grievances that animated Afghan politics. It did not write the sermons or the poetry or the war songs, but it did help arm men whose ambitions extended beyond repelling invaders, and it did rely on a partner whose regional agenda was not identical to Washington's. The pipeline that worked so well in the 1980s was not fully dismantled in the 1990s. Rather, it was repurposed, frayed, tapped by new actors, and ultimately fed a landscape where the word Taliban would move from a term for students to a term for a regime. A more expansive accounting would include the millions of refugees who learned adulthood in camps, the education they received or did not, the economy that formed around aid and smuggling, the madrasa networks that flourished alongside black markets, and the ways in which victory without reconstruction is merely an intermission between catastrophes. For Washington, the domestic narrative of Operation Cyclone long emphasized success. Without a Marine landing, without a formal declaration, the Soviet Union had been compelled to quit a war it could not win at an acceptable price. The cost to U.S. taxpayers, spread across a decade and matched by Saudi funds, looked small next to the strategic effect. The intelligence community added a chapter to its lore in which case officers and logisticians bent the arc of a superpower's ambition. Politicians could claim they had helped David sling stones at Goliath, but the end of a covert action is not the end of its consequences. When the program's spigot closed, Afghanistan did not. Guns and ghosts remained. On the ground, the men who had carried those crates understood intimately what outside observers sometimes forgot. Aid is not neutrally caloric. It nourishes certain muscles and atrophies others. When an external patron pays your wages and replenishes your ammunition, you learn to fight better than you learn to govern. When weapons arrive more easily than textbooks, the next generation inherits habits that make rebels more quickly than they make road engineers. Commanders whose power derives from their ability to distribute spoils have little incentive to design stable taxation. Judges who rule by reputation and proximity do not need statutes that bind distant districts. The war economy is a lever that is easy to pull and hard to release. Operation Cyclone, by design and by necessity, pulled that lever for a long time. One can argue that there was no alternative. Without support, the resistance might have been crushed, and a Soviet-aligned government would have solidified, reshaping the geopolitics of South and Central Asia. One can argue that different partners might have been chosen, different commanders emphasized, different conditionalities enforced, different timetables set for political training to accompany rifle training. One can argue that after February 1989, the United States should have spent as much on reconstruction, refugee education, and state building as it had spent on the covert war. All of these arguments hold fragments of truth. None of them can retroactively calculate the cost of what didn't happen. History records what did. A decade of covert action that helped make continued occupation untenable for the USSR, followed by years of civil war that discredited expectations that victory in the field automatically ripens into governance. Amid the abstractions, the ledger of lives remained stubborn. A boy in Kunar learned to recognize helicopter silhouettes before he learned to write his name. A pilot from Smolensk learned to fly low through valleys until a rumor about a new missile persuaded him to fly high, and then persuaded him to fly home. A commander in Paktia became a patron to dozens of families by distributing rifles and sacks of flour. He also became a target for rivals nurtured by the same external pipeline. A refugee teacher in a Peshawar camp turned a donated tent into a classroom and tried to hold attention while explosions punctuated grammar. A case officer on a short tour imagined strategy as a spreadsheet and left before the column that added long-term costs was due. A bureaucrat in Washington signed off on another tranche because to do otherwise would be to admit that the present depended on a future no one intended to fund. The technicalities mattered. Logistics into landlocked Afghanistan required redundancy, alternate routes through Chaman and Torkham, caches buried against raids, a culture of falsified bills of lading that, over time, became indistinguishable from a culture of corruption. The mix of weapons mattered. Too many mines and you sowed future misery. Too few and the present war favored armor. Communications mattered. A radio net makes a guerrilla force feel like a nation in embryo, even if it is merely a brigade in practice. Training doctrine mattered. When demolition becomes identity, bridges become metaphors rather than infrastructure. Even field medicine mattered. A fighter who believes he can survive a wound returns to the fight sooner, but a clinic that treats only fighters becomes a political instrument rather than a civic good. The more the program grew, the more it resembled an improvised state that lacked only taxes and election days. It governed nothing and influenced everything. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet command had adapted to the insurgency's harassing style, mounting large sweeps, strengthening outposts, reorganizing Afghan government units, and attempting to control population centers while leaving the countryside to whomever owned the night. The resistance, saturated with small arms and emboldened by better anti-air capabilities, adapted with better intelligence, more sophisticated ambushes, and raids designed to generate film for foreign consumption, propaganda as logistics. The war became a cycle of demonstration and response, and the foreign audiences, donors, politicians, sympathizers, journalists, became an invisible front that commanders learned to fight on. A spectacular attack could alter budgets on a different continent. A captured soldier on camera could move a line item that would otherwise have stayed buried in a committee. The Geneva Accords did not end these dynamics, they set the stage for their mutation. As Soviet troops withdrew between May 1988 and February 1989, the Najibullah government, supplied, advised, and staffed by Afghans who had staked their survival on its endurance, demonstrated more resilience than many had predicted. For a time, it held against the expectation of collapse. The aid pipeline had meanwhile begun to change shape as U.S. attention thinned. Pakistan continued to back clients who would, in Islamabad's view, produce a government friendly enough to satisfy security planners who saw India everywhere. Saudi Arabia's money still moved, but its ideological currents moved too, and they coursed through places that had little use for borders when doctrine felt like destiny. The American debate afterward turned on a sharp question: should the covert success have been followed by overt nation-building? To answer yes is to recommend a policy that would have been difficult to sell in 1990. To answer no is to admit that Washington had purchased an outcome it wasn't prepared to invest in keeping. The legacy of Operation Cyclone has been narrated as triumph, tragedy, cautionary tale, and prelude. In truth, it is all four, depending on which year and which valley you choose to fix your gaze upon. As an instrument of Cold War strategy, it achieved its narrowest stated aim: the Soviet Union left. As an intervention in Afghan society, it accelerated militarization and distorted political development in ways that made compromise feel like betrayal and elections feel like weakness. As a lesson in alliances, it underscored that partners who share enemies do not necessarily share futures. As a study in unintended consequences, it reminds strategists that pipelines built for one purpose rarely dry up when the donor loses interest. They are seized, repurposed, and mythologized by whomever arrives next. And yet, to leave the account at abstraction is to miss the men at the ridgeline, the women who buried sons and then fled with daughters, the Soviet conscripts who learned to fear an empty covert, the case officer who learned that the most reliable trucker was the one who wanted less money than his peers because he was, in fact, skimming less than his peers and would therefore last longer. It is to miss the Pakistani officer who believed sincerely that he was both defending his country and forging a buffer that history had denied him. It is to miss the refugee child who learned to read in a tent printed with a foreign NGO's logo and who would later translate that reading into a sermon or a poem or a set of instructions for assembling a bomb. Operation Cyclone was not a device. It was a decade of choices created by other choices, enacted by people whose names seldom made it into the memos that authorized the next shipment. If a moral is required, it is not that arming the oppressed is always wrong or that abstaining is always wise. It is that tools acquire users beyond their makers, and stories acquire authors beyond their sponsors. The United States armed the Afghan Mujahideen to injure a rival's ambition, and it succeeded, but the momentum of that success carried materials, men, and meanings into the next conflict, and the next. The program's architects measured supply tonnage and mission reports. Their successors would one day measure the cost of new wars in which some of the old beneficiaries appeared under new names. In the end, the mountains outlasted the crates. The passes remained. The wind continued to carry the sound of mortars farther than it carried radio waves. And somewhere in a valley that never showed up on a committee map, a fighter looked at an empty ammunition box stamped in a language he could not read and used it as a stool while he waited for the next convoy that would prove that the world had not finished with his country and that his country had not finished with the world.